does show me, on display settings, it does show me as connected to the second display. So the problem is somewhere else.
Is it a mirroring mode?
I'm sorry?
Is it mirroring or I don't know?
It's not mirroring.
I can try with my laptop.
Oh, okay, here we go. Something happened. Searching for sources. No, it's not me. Maybe if you unplug the other source, unplug that source, maybe it'll help find this source. The talk is highly visual, so it's just not even worth starting until we're projecting. Yeah. Okay, so you're seeing it, but it's not. Okay. Yeah. So, oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm Mark Miller, and I'm going to speak to you today about our approach to ownership in support of the goal of offer-safe trade of mutable objects. The talk itself is split into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to explain our approach to ownership, which we call e-rights, the key attribute that we achieve there that distinguishes it from other ownership systems is credibly transferable ownership. Then in the second part, I'll be speaking about Zoe, which is our smart contracting framework that provides an important safety property we call offer safety. And then in the third part, I'll be speaking about the new result, which is still in progress engineering-wise, which is ownables, which is where we extend this framework to deal with the special problems that have to do with trade of mutable objects. So we can divide property rights ownership in support of trade into 3 primary attributes. If you just thinking in terms of the pre-computer science normal property rights literature, if you own something, you can exercise your right of ownership. You can use an object that you've got. So translated into the terms of objects, it means you can invoke the behavior of the object, provoke whatever behavior happens as a result of invoking the object. Exclusive transfer of the rights of ownership, meaning that if you own an object, not only can you use it, but you can transfer to someone else the exclusive rights of ownership. And that's a recursive definition, so that once you've transferred to them the rights of ownership, you no longer have either the right of exercise or the right of ownership, and that they in turn have both, so they can further transfer the right of ownership. And then assay, which is just a fancy term for measure, like assaying a bar of gold to know credibly that it is gold and how much gold it is. So being able to credibly measure an asset that will be traded is necessary in order to bring about credible trade. So the object capability approach only gives us itself one of these three properties directly. By having a capability to an object, you can invoke the object and provoke whatever behavior it is. And in fact, you can think of an object capability exactly as the permission to provoke the behavior of the object it designates. By RCAP here, I mean reference capabilities, but I actually mean that in the broad sense. Both the language constructs referred to specifically as reference capabilities, but also ownership types, also linear types, affine types, all of these static type system, reasoning systems for transferring exclusive ownership. And those actually meet both of these criteria with the full recursion there. When you transfer with the reference capability, you lose both exercise and ownership, and the receiver now has both exercise and ownership and can further transfer. However, reference capabilities do not, within the framework, within the distributed system framework constraints that I'll be explaining, reference capabilities do not provide for credible assay. The E-rights framework, which we've been developing for a long time, provides for the exclusive transfer of ownership and for the credible assay, but it does not provide for exercise. It's only the transfer of symbolic rights. And what we need is to support all three properties together in order to get offer-safe trade of mutable objects. So we're doing all of this with a smart contract system running on top of an object capability system, running on blockchains and other things. So before we get into smart contracts in that new abstract world, let's examine in some depth a smart contract that we're all familiar with. A vending machine is a mechanistic embodiment of an exchange contract. My money for the seller's snack. Now the notion of exchange, money for a snack, is a symmetric notion. Even though it's symmetric, for some reason, I've never seen a vending machine that first gives me the snack and then demands my money. And the reason is that the vending machine's enforcement abilities does not extend beyond the box. If it gave me the snack first and then I ran away without giving it the money, it could not run after me demanding the money. So instead, the vending machine implements an escrow exchange contract. The snacks are already visibly escrowed from the seller, displayed to the prospective buyer so they can see what the choices are that are already in escrow. When the buyer puts in the money, the vending machine is now has in escrow everything it needs to enforce the terms of the contract. Once both the snack and the money are escrowed, it can now make the snack available to me, make my money available to the seller. It's even a good example of this principle offer safety, which is offer safety is that each of the parties to the exchange either gets what they said they want or gets a full refund of everything that they had placed into escrow. So a good, well-functioning vending machine, if it fails to give me the snack I asked for, I can hit the refund button and I get back everything that I had escrowed on the way. However, it does not fulfill the recursive aspect of ownership or the trade in the face of mutability. It's a one-time sale. Once I buy the drink and I start drinking it, the remainder of the drink is no longer an asset that I can sell. So at that point, the remainder of the drink has value to me, but it is not transferable value. The value of the drink as it's in escrow in the vending machine is not just something that's prospectively of value to me, it's transferable value. So a positive example with regard to that issue is selling a house. The house goes through two phases, typically. In one phase, you're living in the house. When you're living in the house, you've got all your stuff scattered around in a way that has a lot of context to it, that's only meaningful to you. So the value to you of living in the house with all of your stuff around, adapted to your lifestyle, there's a tremendous amount of value that is non-transferable value. But then when you go to sell the house, a typical pattern is you then vacate the house, you remove all of the stuff that has the non-transferable value, leaving behind the house that is the remaining value of the house is the house that has the transferable value, the house for a buyer to then acquire in order to gain that transferable value. The other thing that's really important about vacating the house is you stop mutating the house. And you do that before the house gets inspected. And the reason you do that is so that the result of the inspection is meaningful and credible to the prospective buyer. If while you're living in the house, you might damage it, lowering its value, you might build an extension to it, raising the value, but in either case, the result, if you were still in the house, the result of the inspection would no longer be a credible signal to the buyer of what they would actually be getting. So the vacating serves both of those purposes. And so the house goes through this two-phase cycle. Once somebody buys the house, they can then live in it with all the scattered non-transferable value and then sell it again. So it has the nice recursive aspect of propagating ownership. So we applied this two-phase cycle to go back and forth between OCAPs, which is our approach to exercise, and E-rights, which is our approach to exclusive rights transfer and assay. But we're skipping the RCAPs column, and since that's sort of a central concern of IWACO, it's worth explaining why it is we chose not to start from the reference capability approach. And to understand that, you need to understand our overall distributed systems framework. We're in a distributed system with many, many machines. Each of the purple rectangles here is a physical machine. Each tower is a logical machine. So a blockchain is a virtual machine that is built out of massive multi-way agreement between many physical machines that redundantly engage in exactly the same computation and then cross-check each other in order to build a virtual machine that's much more trustworthy than any physical piece of hardware can be. But we're in an overall system that has multiple blockchains, mutually suspicious, talking to each other, as well as non-blockchains, private permissioned replicated systems as well as non-replicated systems. On top of this, we run our world of VATs. A VAT is a process-like unit in the communicating event loops concurrency model, where each VAT is a separate unit of concurrency with one internal thread of control running an event loop. And these VATs talk to each other very much in the same way, whether they're on the same machine or whether they're across different machines on the network. On top of that, we build our distributed object capability system, where objects within the same VAT talk to each other with the security properties enforced using programming language technology. And then when an object talks to an object on another VAT on another machine, the object capability security properties are enforced cryptographically by the cryptographic protocol. So the overall result is that we have mutually suspicious objects on mutually suspicious machines talking to each other. And the mutual suspicion at both levels is important. On top of that, we build our system of e-rights and smart contracting. And that's where we're actually going to spend most of the talk. But before we get there, the important property with regard to the distributed systems constraints is exactly this mutual suspicion. We've got mutual suspicion among the machines, and we have mutual suspicion among the objects. Reasoning about mutual suspicion at all these different levels would seem to be very complicated. We need a simplified theory that nevertheless captures for us everything we need to worry about as we're doing secure programming. So there's this property that object capabilities made into a distributed protocol have that we make much use of, which is a misbehaving machine cannot do damage to other participants on the network that is in excess of the damage that can be done by a misbehaving group of objects running on a correct platform. So where the objects are themselves constrained by the object capability rules, but are doing things that you might consider to be misbehavior. So a way to the phrase we like to use is you can reason about all suspicion as if you were suspicious only of objects. And the way objects capabilities achieve this is actually very straightforward, which is the cryptographic protocol, effects are performed outside the system by utilizing a capability to an object elsewhere. And the cryptographic protocol ensures that even a misbehaving machine cannot use a capability unless it has been given to some object on that machine. If the machine as a whole has never gotten the capability, then the machine cannot use it. And that's equivalent to all of the objects on that machine being together in a vast conspiracy such that any capability that's given to any of them are then used by the conspiracy of objects to do damage elsewhere. So to put it another way, ignorance about whether the platform misbehaves can, without loss of generality, be represented as ignorance of the configuration of objects running on the machine. And therefore, we can reason at a uniform level where in the same worries that you would have interacting with the local object that you're suspicious of, you can use to interact with a remote object that you're suspicious of running on a platform you're suspicious of. So our constraints are mutually suspicious peers, blockchains, other machines. The VAT-to-VAT communication, it basically just needs to be a secure bidirectional data pipe. So TLS among normal machines, the IBC is the inter-blockchain protocol that is a protocol to do TLS-like bidirectional data pipes between blockchains. In both cases, what we build on top of that is OCAPN, our cryptographic distributed remote invocation object capability protocol. And having done that, OCAPS becomes a good local theory of the possibility of remote misbehavior. And the reason that they're a good theory is that they are weak enough to correspond to what can be enforced cryptographically. By contrast, RCAPS is too strong a theory. It's a theory that gives us very valuable security properties that can be enforced locally, but this exclusive rights transfer that is sort of guaranteed statically by the RCAP type system does not represent a good theory of what you can count on remotely. For a cryptographic protocol to enforce that on a counterparty remotely, it would have to cryptographically enforce that the counterparty cannot double spend. All of the the best we know for solving the double spending problem is blockchains, and the blockchain approach to double spending is just to provide very good evidence that the blockchain does not engage in double spending, but it is not something where I, interacting with the blockchain, am engaged in a protocol that prevents it from double spending. So I have to still still have to worry about whether or not it is engaged in double spending. So there's still a trust issue, a judgment issue. So in the e-rights approach, the issuer, which I'll be explaining, is the reification of the suspicion of remote behavior, so that you can say that the trust that you're placing in a foreign issuer reflects your suspicion judgment about whether or not that issuer is double spending the currency that it issues. Yes?
This is a really interesting point, so I really appreciate you making it. I am curious about the argument that RCAPs are too strong, which I agree is true looking purely locally, but could I not build a virtual machine on the blockchain that provides the guarantee to the same degree as the blockchain, right, which probably most people find is sufficient, and give the programmer the view from an RCAP's perspective?
Okay, so if you were willing to simply fully trust any other arbitrary blockchain out there that is doing what you say, such that to put trust in more explicit terms, if you're willing to be fully vulnerable to your assumption being violated, then the answer is yes. The premise already in the multi-blockchain ecosystem held together with protocols like IBC is already that the blockchains are mutually suspicious, that the code that's running on a blockchain and the immediate clients of that blockchain generally implicitly trust the immediate blockchain they're interacting with, but the blockchain's communicating with other the code on that blockchain in turn communicates with the code running on other blockchains with assets that are issued by issuers on other blockchains, and generally those connections are one where you're very careful about making explicit the trust assumptions, so that if another blockchain misbehaves, double spends or inflates its currency in a way that it promised not to or whatever, that the immediate blockchain is not itself subject to, does not itself misbehave because of the implied misbehavior of something else. Oh, and I should say also, the fact that it's too strong to be a local theory of remote misbehavior is not an argument against doing RCAPs or stronger type systems locally. I mean, this is also the case with many other static type systems. It's too strong to represent guarantees about remote misbehavior. Nevertheless, they can be useful to program with locally, but you just have to remain unconfused about what they are and are not guaranteeing in the context of an overall distributed system. So, this code brings about the E-rights level of abstraction for the example of money. Money is a great, simple, and you know, clearly sort of the first example of interest of an asset that needs to have the E-rights properties, that it's that ownership can be transferred, that in the transfer it can be assayed so the receiver can credibly know what they would be getting, and money is not exercisable. The only thing you can do with it is transfer and keep records. There's no mutable, there's you know, you can't eat a dollar bill. There's no mutable object there that you can make use of. So this code is a realistic piece of code that really brings about the E-rights level abstraction built purely out of the object capability level of abstraction. It's worth stepping through how this code works. So on the outside here, okay, there we go. On the outside here, we have our make-mint function. And each time make-mint is called, it creates three objects, the ledger, the issuer, and the mint. So let's call it, so now we've got these three objects, ledger, issuer, and mint, that together represent a money system, that instantiates a logical currency. So let's invoke make-mint a few more times. Each of these planes is a separate logical currency, a separate currency system, each isolated from the other. Now, with this currency on top, which we'll call bucks, we can invoke the mint object in order to create a purse, and we're going to do that to create a purse with 100 bucks in it that we're going to give to Alice to set up the initial conditions. We're going to do it again to create a purse with 200 bucks in it that we give to Bob. So every time we call purse, it creates a purse object and then registers the purse in the ledger with the associated value being the initial balance. Okay, so having set up the initial conditions, we're now going to examine a scenario in which Alice wants to buy from Bob a concert ticket. So Alice starts this by sending to her main purse a withdraw message, and oh, I'm sorry, got ahead of myself. Hold on. Sending the withdraw message, and the withdraw message creates a new payment purse and changes the ledger to move the requested amount of assets from being associated with the main purse to being associated with the payment purse. And then the payment purse is returned to Alice. Alice can then use it to send a buy message to Bob. And at this point, we have an interesting dilemma. As far as Alice is concerned, she has paid Bob. She sent Bob the payment object. But as far as Bob's concerned, he's not really been paid yet. All he's gotten is some object from someone that had the ability to send him an object. He doesn't know that it's actually a purse. If he knew it was a purse, he doesn't know it's a purse of the same currency. If he knew it was a purse of the same currency, he doesn't know that it has adequate funds in it. And most of all, he doesn't know that Alice has dropped her reference. So even if he knew it was a purse of the same currency with adequate funds now, he doesn't know it will still have adequate funds by the time he deposits it. So, so right now, Bob only has the assurances at the OCAP level of abstraction. He's got an object he can invoke. He can exercise it. But it might be shared with Alice, and it's completely opaque to him. He doesn't know what he's gotten. What he needs is something at the E-rights level of abstraction. He needs the rights that Alice tried to convey by sending him the payment, and he needs those rights exclusively. He needs to know that Alice no longer has those rights, and he needs to know what rights it is that he's gotten. So he achieves all of this by sending the deposit message to his main purse with the payment purse as argument. If the deposit message succeeds, then Bob knows that the rights have been transferred. Notice that the payment purse went from 10 to 0. Bob's main purse went from 200 to 210. What he knows is that he has now gotten exclusive access to the rights that were conveyed. Notice he did not get exclusive access to any object. The rights themselves are not an object. They cannot reify them at the level of the theory of objects. Alice might still have a hold of the payment purse. It's just the payment purse is now useless to her because the rights it represents have been moved. And the deposit method also verifies in doing so that it is a payment purse of the same currency and had adequate funds having moved them. So before leaving the slide, I just want to call your attention to the issuer, which will become important later on. The issuer itself, whose identity is used symbolically to stand for this currency as a whole. You know, bucks versus yen versus some other currency, each of which are identified uniquely by a distinct issuer identity. The issuer itself only has a make empty purse message that creates a new empty purse, thereby does not convey any of the E-rights by doing it. It just creates an empty vessel. And then the purse itself has a get issuer method that reveals the issuer that the purse is a purse of. I also want to avoid painting too rosy a picture. This code, while correct and would actually do what everything I claim when run on the foundations that we've built, this is simpler. By the time we make this all work in production within the constraints of all of the other engineering goals that we have, it's substantially more a piece of code. So I don't want to misrepresent that. But it's not a hugely larger piece of code. It's still readable, inspectable code that you can examine and gain confidence in. But even for this much more extensive piece of code, a point I want to make is that this piece of code brings about this decentralized, distributed, cryptographic money protocol among all of these participants, and the code itself never mentions any cryptographic concepts. That we invest all of the work in building a cryptographic protocol in getting the object capability layer, having it achieve its security properties, and then having done that, we can now express all of these properties purely in terms of objects and build the E-rights layer of abstraction in turn. On top of that, continuing to avoid the need to explicitly talk about cryptography. Okay. so having built the the e-rights level abstraction on top of objects, now let's shift our visual language to directly reify the concepts at the e-rights layer, where the rights that are being transferred themselves have a visual representation. So we can see that in terms of purses, where the right moves between purses, or sometimes more abstractly, we'll just use the notation of the right moving between Alice and Bob, with the purses themselves being implicit. So that concludes the first part of the talk, with talking about the relationship between these two levels of abstraction, emphasizing that the underlying parts are the ones that we're building up to, that we'll achieve in the third part of the talk, is how to achieve all of those simultaneously. But right now they're separated in two levels of abstraction. So with that, I will briefly take questions before going to the second part.
Do we have some questions?
Okay. Okay. So, offer safety, the refund button on the vending machine. The e-rights that we've explained so far enable Alice to buy a concert ticket from Bob. By sending the payment to Bob, Bob can verify that he's been paid, what he expects to be paid, and then release the concert ticket to Alice. That fully protects Bob from the possibility of Alice's misbehavior, but it does not at all protect Alice from the possibility of Bob's misbehavior. What we need is all or nothing bilateral trade with offer safety. So either Alice gets the ticket she wanted, Bob got the money he wanted, or the entire trade is called off and none of the participants lose anything. To do that, we have to introduce an intermediary, which is our escrow exchange, like the vending machine sitting between the buyer and the seller. The 5 parties here might be on 5 separate machines. The issuer might be running on one blockchain somewhere in the ecosystem. The Bucks issuer might be running on one blockchain somewhere in the ecosystem. The ticket issuer might be running elsewhere. The escrow exchange will typically, that's the thing that everybody has to have mutual coordination on, has to be highly credible. So it's probably running on a blockchain. And then Alice and Bob might be just running on their own solo machines, speaking to the other machines. But everybody's running this distributed object capability fabric. So when Alice, to initiate the trade, might send in a message to the escrow exchange saying, I'm giving this many bucks in, and I want a concert ticket for seat 3F7. Now, the important thing here is that the want line is purely descriptive. It's just conveying information. The give line is the actual asset. So Alice, in sending this message in, had to withdraw that asset from her purse and move the asset, provide the asset to the escrow exchange in just the same way that in the previous diagrams, Alice had transferred an asset by sending a payment purse to Bob. Now she's transferring the asset into the escrow exchange, and the escrow exchange proceeds now to use this make empty purse message on the issuer to create a credible empty purse that neither Alice nor Bob have access to. Only the escrow exchange has access to it, and to use that to escrow the asset. Likewise, Bob escrowing the ticket, saying what he wants in exchange, and the escrow exchange escrowing that. And now that the escrow exchange has both assets escrowed, only at this point can it safely release Bob's ticket to Alice and release Alice's money to Bob. And then Bob can can deposit the money into Bob's money purse. Alice can deposit the ticket into her ticket's purse. Now, I think that this addresses Jonathan's point about you always have to reason about mutual suspicion. Any code might be buggy or might be running on a buggy platform, and you always have to ask, what's the worst case damage it could do to me if it were misbehaving? If either it's malicious or it's simply buggy in a way that creates an exploitable vulnerability, and somebody can exploit that vulnerability to make it act maliciously. So in the case of a malicious escrow exchange, it can just, having escrowed the rights, it can now just run off with them. It can steal all the escrowed rights, so Alice and Bob get nothing. Now, the answer that we generally seek across all systems to any code might be buggy is we want to create a the code that for which we have a tremendous amount of vulnerability. We want to keep that code very, very small, like an operating system microkernel. Keep that code very, very small, have it do a very constrained, well-characterized, specifiable job, have it be highly vetted and then highly reused, so that over time we can come to have confidence that it's operating correctly. But it's only confidence, it's never certainty. You can never reduce that to zero risk. So it's just a question of degrees of confidence and levels of risk. Now, shifting examples, the escrow exchange as a smart contract sitting between these parties is actually very similar to an auctioneer sitting between the parties. Let's say that Bob, in the role of seller, wanted to auction off a concert ticket. Alice, in the role of a bidder, is now engaged in the same activity in order to place a bid. The amount of money that she sends in is the amount of her bid. But now she's one of several bidders, and the auctioneer is supposed to pick a bidder and as the winner of the auction and do the exchange there and then refund all of the other bidders. Just to make it a little bit more interesting, let's say furthermore that we're going to be considering second price auctions where the second price auctions where the amount that the top bidder is charged is the amount of the second highest bid. So we understand what job the auctioneer one is supposed to do, but again, any code might be buggy. If this auctioneer is buggy, it can again run off with all of the escrowed assets, both the money and the ticket from everyone, and nobody else gets anything. So for an escrow exchange, which is simple, we can do the highly vetted, highly reusable piece of code. For an auctioneer and a zillion other special purpose smart contracts, we don't want to have that level of risk. So instead, we create the Zoe framework, where Zoe itself is in some sense a generalization of the escrow exchange agent that we've already seen. But it's a smart contracting framework such that a smart contract, like a second price auction, then runs on top of, within the Zoe framework. So the relationship between these two is that the smart contracts running on Zoe never gets their hands on the asset itself and therefore cannot run away with it. When Alice, as bidder one, says that she wants seat 37F, and the money that she escrows is the amount of her first price bid. She have to escrow the first price, even though she's only going to be charged the second price if she wins, because in the limit, the second price that she's going to be charged will be the same as the first price. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the key point here. So, Alice communicated with Zoe, giving Zoe the actual assets which Zoe escrowed. Only once Zoe escrows it does Zoe then communicate to the auctioneer purely information in both the give and the want portions, saying this is what that first bidder put in and this is what they want. So the auctioneer never sees the assets themselves. Likewise, when Bob, as the seller, is putting the ticket up to be auctioned off, it says that it wants $10 in this case. That's what's known in auctions as the reserve price. It's saying, this is the minimal that I want. If I don't get at least $10, call the auction off. So you still get offer safety with regard to the reserve price. That's right. It's a description of $10. It's saying this is the, so the auctioneer is only seeing descriptions of the rights to be given or gotten. It never sees the rights themselves. Okay, and then the auctioneer, if it's operating properly, it then sends to Zoe a directive to atomically rearrange the allocations in Zoe's bookkeeping associated with each of the parties. It says, send to bidder one, it tells Zoe, allocate to bidder one the ticket, move that allocation from associated with the seller to associated with bidder one, move $40 from bidder one's allocation to the seller's allocation, because let's say that was the amount of the second price, and then give back to bidder one the change, which is $2. The default allocation of all participants is simply the amount that they placed in, so that all of the bidders for whom the atomic rearrange does not mention them, implicitly the allocation would be to do a refund. So when the auction then tells Zoe, okay, we're done, exit all, everybody gets what the auctioneer told Zoe to allocate. And then they can go ahead and deposit those assets into their respective purses. Now, if Zoe is misbehaving, it's just the same as the escrow exchange agent misbehaving or auctioneer one misbehaving. But again, Zoe is supposed to be a highly vetted, highly reusable piece of code that underlies all of these different smart contracts and that is doing a very well-characterized, specifiable job. So we wanted to gain a lot of confidence that Zoe is operating correctly. So let's say that Zoe is correct. What about if the auctioneer misbehaves? If the auctioneer 2, which is the auctioneer running on top of Zoe, misbehaves? What's the worst case damage that it can do? Well, Zoe prevents it from violating offer safety. That doesn't mean that it can't do any damage. That doesn't mean we don't need to worry about its misbehavior. The remaining misbehavior that is possible for auctioneer 2 is that it can give the ticket to somebody other than the highest bidder. It can charge them the first price rather than the second price, not giving them any change. It can give the seller only the reserve price and steal the remainder. All of the other bidders, since they didn't get the good, they still have to get a full refund, no matter what the auctioneer 2 might want to maliciously do to the contrary. So everyone still leaves this arrangement with their stated minimum requirements met. Now, we still have to worry about misbehavior of the auctioneer. People participated assuming it was a second price auctioneer awarding things to the highest bidder. This is still misbehavior you need to worry about, but the level of risk that remains once you've guaranteed offer safety is minuscule compared to the level of risk that we had before we constrained this by offer safety. So in this picture, I want to emphasize the various objects involved from an object capability perspective. The participants, the seat objects that they're using to send these messages into Zoe, once the contract is in motion, the seat object is used by the participants to get their payouts. So in other words, the seat object is the right to obtain the payout. These little arrow icons that you saw in the rearrange message, they're given to the contract to name the participants in order to express the rearrangement. And so we call those seat resolvers because each one of those represents the ability to determine what the payout is of that participant, but it can only determine that within the constraints of offer safety. And that concludes part 2. And now, if there are any questions, now would be a good time. Wow. Okay. Yes.
Did I misunderstand you, or did you say something just towards the end of the first third that like you do not sort of reify the operations themselves? I mean, when you were talking about basically object capabilities versus reference capability.
The rights being transferred are not themselves reifiable at the object level. So that's right. Where I've introduced these 2 levels of abstraction. So going back to the mint with the money is really the clearest way to understand that. In the blue diagram where I was showing the objects involved, showing the object capability level of abstraction, there was no visual reification. There was no thing there to point at that was the motion of the money.
Yep.
The money was moved only by manipulating the ledger entries. That was the bookkeeping, recording who has, what rights are associated with what purse. But then when I shifted to the orange diagram, then we had a visual representation of the money as something that was moving exclusively. So that was I think the point that you might be referring to.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And the goal is it to bring them together in the same layer in the end, or no?
No. The goal is to achieve together the offer-safe trade of mutable objects that requires exercise, which, like the house, where the exercise might change the tradable value, and also still the trade of the tradable value in an offer-safe, credible manner. And to just preview where we're about to go, immediately actually, is that the house is the example for understanding the approach, which is the 2-phase cycle, cycling between the rights being embodied in a capability that's exercisable and the right being embodied in an E-right that's credibly transferable, but where during that phase, like the house that you vacated, nobody's in a position to mutate the mutable object in question while it's in this credibly transferable representation.
Right. So like if I did like a fractional permissions interpretation of what you're doing, Is it like I'm taking a fraction out of the house and I'm giving it to you? Now neither of us can mutate it, but we can both inspect it. And then if we have like a reified operation that basically allows us to atomically trade fractions, then we could both look at what we are going to give each other and then either give it or not give it.
That's actually an excellent analogy. I have not previously thought of how this relates to the fractional permission notion, but yeah, it's actually a very good analogy. It'll be interesting to see if there's more depth there.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a question too, if there is nothing else. I wanted to ask, so if there is still some risk remaining in how these auctioneers behave, then would something like, I'm sort of trying to puzzle out like, why can't we use something like formal verification to check that these auctioneers don't act exactly as we expect them to? Right? Do we really need to give them that much freedom?
Formal verification is great, but the auctioneer is an example of zillions of contracts that you will build on top of and run on Zoe, and the open-ended nature of our need for contracts is such that for many of these contracts, simply specifying them and being confident that the specification that you wrote down means what you think it means is already hard. The other thing is returning to the point about you can reason about all suspicion as if you are suspicious only of objects. A proof that the code satisfies the specification is not a guarantee that the platform's behavior will be according to the code. So, but really, in this case, because the auctioneer is running on top of Zoe, which is running on the same platform, that second point is actually not relevant to the distinction between the trust in Zoe versus the trust in the contract. Really, the issue is that formal verification is hard, and for many things that have been formally verified that I would like to have high trust in, the specifications that I've seen, like the specification of the SEL4 kernel, for example, is already harder to understand than many pieces of code that I already do not have confidence that I understand. So formal verification is basically just shifting the problem from does this code mean what I think it means to the problem of does the specification mean what I think it means. It's still progress, but it's not certainty. It's an argument for lowering the risk. It does not get rid of the risk. Yeah.
I guess maybe a sort of a follow-up on that. So I know for SEL4 in particular.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Sort of a follow-up to that question, and maybe kind of a response. I just want to know what you think. So for SEL4 in particular, I know like they have the full specification of they have a full behavioral specification, but they have about those behavioral specifications. They also have these like higher level basically more proofs that they satisfy like confidentiality, integrity, availability. So like they've done a lot of reasoning that basically like their specifications of the kernel reduce to reasonable properties that themselves are readable.
Yeah, I don't want to minimize any of that. All of that is tremendously valuable.
Sure.
But again, all of that is evidence that risk is lower.
Right.
It is not a source of certainty.
Sure. Right.
Yeah. Wait for microphone.
I guess in some ways the risk is lower, but the trust relationships are more complex because you know, in the real world, the question is, how do you trust somebody that they've verified your how do you trust that the verification of your formal methods is correct? And the answer is, well, obviously it is, because we are going to trust whoever it is. We'll trust Thierry Coquin to personally verify our code, and then we'll trust some cryptographic proof that in fact the code agrees with the specification. And in these days of quantum computing, if I wanted to make an awful lot of money, well, actually, if I wanted to make an awful lot of money, I don't know, I'd convince people that I could build a Hyperloop or a self-driving car, or that I could govern America. But the point is, what am I trying to say? The point is that you not only now have to trust the proof, you have to trust that the proof maps to the code. And in the days of quantum computing, are you sure in that cryptographic proof now? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. I actually disagree, because I think the biggest, the only thing I think I disagree with what you said is you said, look, everybody in this auction is going to get their minimum deal.
If Zoe is operating.
If Zoe is operating correctly, everybody is going to get their minimum deal. Yes, you're right. In some sense, the technical risk, the low-level risk that someone is going to run off with all the money has gone. But I don't want to comment about New Zealand politics that nobody knows about. The big risk is, for example, that you make a donation to the auctioneer the night before the rules change for, say, £10,000, and then the auctioneer changes the rule to save you £50 million. So the catch is that if Zoe runs away with the stuff, everybody's going to agree that it's been stolen. But if you get to the auctioneer, it's actually the biggest risk, precisely because Zoe is authenticating the transaction. And then you say, okay, well, let's just agree that everybody else, for example, you have a consensus thing, everybody else has got to agree the auction is fair, and in fact, all the information on the bids could be public and certified, and you could do all that if you wanted to. But then you've got the opposite risk, which is that a bidder who loses could still say, I lost because the auctioneer cheated.
So,
if this makes sense.
Let's return to this slide. So the issue of a rule change is a fascinating issue. We call the for us in software, of course, this is the upgrade issue, and running these smart contracts as long-lived contracts on blockchain, the upgrade issue is huge for us. And it's something that I just don't have time to get into in depth in the talk, but it's worth touching on. Because a contract might be buggy, early on, when the risk of it being buggy is high, you want there to be some ability for somebody that is the steward of the contract. The analogy would be some legislative body being able to say, okay, here's a new piece of code that fixes the bug. Let's replace the existing behavior from the existing code with this new piece of code, with this repaired behavior, and do that for running contract instances that already have assets at stake. And the problem, of course, is that well, let's say with Auctioneer 1, the conventional way to do smart contracts without Zoe, the risk of a malicious upgrade is huge, because if the governing body who's able to make a decision to upgrade the code makes a malicious decision, even if the original auctioneer was correct, the new auctioneer that was the malicious upgrade can now run off with all the assets again. If Zoe is upgraded, then a malicious upgrade of Zoe has exactly the same risk as a malicious upgrade of the original escrow exchange agent or the original Auctioneer 1. If Auctioneer 2 is upgraded, within our upgrade framework, we have this unique guarantee that I think is a huge deal, of offer safety constrained upgrade, that even a malicious upgrade of Auctioneer 2 that happens within this framework, where the original Auctioneer 2 might have been non-malicious, but the new one done by malicious governance decision replaces the code in flight with a malicious one, it is still the case that the result of the malicious upgrade cannot violate these constraints. This is still the worst case that can happen. Now, this worst case, again, it's not pleasant. It means that people got defrauded. People thought they were participating in a second price auction and they were not. But it's the level of risk that remains after offer safety is guaranteed is tiny compared to the level of risk if you just give the malicious code the assets directly. Does that answer the question? Microphone, please.
The more people trust Zoe, that changes the perception of I think it actually changes the real risk. So the more people trust Zoe, the more the risk changes from people running away with the money, so failing these things, and the more the risk switches to getting to the auctioneer. That's probably really all I want to say.
I don't understand.
Because in a more open system, if it's clear and I can show evidence that someone has run off with my money, there will probably be remedies outside the system that can be brought to bear. And I know you don't believe in remedies outside the system.
Well, it's not that it's not that I don't believe it. It's that I'm in an ecosystem in which many billions of dollars have disappeared because of exploiting bugs in smart contracts. And when that money disappears, it disappears immediately with no recourse. By the rules of the road of the kind of commerce system we're engaging in, there generally is no recourse when fraud and theft happens. Now, obviously, that's a problem, and it's a problem that can be addressed. But it's only addressed taking on various other costs. So those themselves are interesting trade-offs. But either way, even if you have to engage in other remedies, it's still bad that the theft happened in the first place. It's still a situation you'd like to avoid.
Right, and in fact, I don't know if you see it this way, but what you're doing here is in fact precisely providing some of that infrastructure, right? Because that's what Zoe is.
So in a way, there's this concept, you know about transactions versus sagas? So there's this term that's been coined, saga, for a transaction-like unit, but that does not proceed atomically. It proceeds in a series of transactions, but the idea for a saga is that if things go badly, there needs to be compensating transactions that undo much of the damage of the early transactions. So Zoe can be seen as a saga system with enforced compensation. So while the contract is in progress, it's not atomic. The situations with the over time as the auction is proceeding are observable situations. But even if the contract misbehaves, the compensation of the refund, if things go badly, that is something that entering into the saga, you know that's the worst case outcome. So that, in some sense, you can think of that as a built-in form of remedy, but it's within the system. So yes.
It's an iterated prisoner's dilemma, not a one-shot.
I don't understand the answer.
Okay. Did you have a third of the talk that you'd still like to give?
I'm sorry? What?
Did you have a third section of the talk
Yes,
you'd
I
still
did.
like to give?
Yes. Fortunately, I still have time even. Okay.
Okay.
So, ownables. This is where we return to the two-phase cycle. So, a nice, simple example of a mutable object in which the value changes with use would be a counter that can only count up. Maybe this counter is like an odometer, where the higher the number, the less valuable it is. So it has an increment method that only counts up. And the assay is provided by this describe method that returns the current count. It's a self-assaying, it's describing itself, but its self-description is as credible as its behavior itself. It's coming from the same piece of code. To make it into an ownable, we wrap it using this make ownable function, where when you call make ownable with the real counter, it creates this new ownable counter that is a revocable forwarder, forwarding messages to the original counter. So in this case, it forwards the increment message, but instead of forwarding the described message as well, instead it provides its own make transfer invitation method that's purely there in the ownable counter. And the make transfer invitation method, being the ownable counter, is the thing that's given out as the object capability that others can use. And since it's given out, they can invoke make transfer invitation. And when they do, make transfer invitation first sets counter to 0, to undefined, severing the access from the ownable counter to the original counter, rendering the ownable counter at this point useless. The next thing is it sends a make invitation method from the contract to Zoe, and the make invitation has these 3 arguments. The handler, which we'll get to, but that's basically a callback, it's a piece of code. The call site is by convention a literal string that uniquely identifies a particular call site in the code of the smart contract this appears in. And details are the self-description gotten from the describe. So we see over here, we got the details by calling the real counters describe, and we then use that up here in the invitation, so here, which is to say that the count at the moment is 1, 2, 3, 4. So having sent off the make invitation, we get back this invitation. And this invitation is an e-write. It's an e-write that is not itself exercisable, but it is exclusively transferable. It is, in this case, it's saying, it's an e-write that says you could count up from whatever the captured count is. And notice that the real counter, while this e-write exists, while this is active, the real counter continues to exist. It still has an increment method on it, but it's encapsulated. It's not visible to anyone else. Nobody can reach it, and therefore nobody can mutate it while the e-write exists. So the e-write's description remains valid, just like with the vacated house. Essentially, revoking that reference to the real counter has vacated it with regard to the possibility of mutation. This is the handler in question that we included in the invitation is just a piece of code that will make a new ownable counter referring to the same original real counter. And the offer operation is the means by which an invitation is redeemed to participate in a smart contract to get the seat, and in this case also to get a new real counter. So the result of the invoking the handler is that we've now invalidated the invitation. The invitation itself has been used up, and instead the offerer, the one who redeemed the invitation, now has a new real counter. So the key thing here is that we've got arbitrary behavior written out as code in a new smart contract, and we still need to satisfy our need to assay things. Now, this creates a burden on someone who would understand what rights they are to read some code within the contract and try to figure out what the code means. And obviously, code understanding in general can be intractable, but the author of the code can try to write the code such that somebody reading the code and inspecting it can understand what it means. And this is, again, where formal verification would be tremendously useful as an element in an overall body of evidence. So the description that appears to describe the right is, again, starts by naming an issuer, in this case the invitation issuer. That's an issuer run by Zoe itself for the invitations, and then the rest of the description in the invitation issuer is a counter installation. Installation is the static code that's running, but the fully linked transitive body of code. So exactly the transitively linked body of code all the way through that's running. The counter instance, the particular instance of that code that represents this running smart contract, the call site, which again identifies by convention uniquely one call site within that smart contract, so that somebody trying to verify what this invitation means knows where in that contract to start looking. And then the details, which comes from the mutable object's own self-description. So altogether, we've gotten back to our two-phase cycle, like with the house, where you have an ownable object that's mutable. You've got the invitation that is exclusively transferable with credible assay. They both refer behind the scenes to the real counter, but the real counter is never exposed, and you've got this two-phase cycle. But the other thing I want to emphasize here, bring back to the visual language, is that by making an offer with an invitation, that participant also gets a seat for further participating in the contract. That's actually where seats come from in our framework. And the handler that was invoked in making the offer, it got one of these seat resolver things for providing the contract the ability to designate which party to change the allocation of, to name in those atomic rearrangement messages. So this is the big aha that I wanted to reveal in this talk, and I should, which is both the seat abstraction and the seat resolver abstraction were not designed with ownability in mind. They were designed just as object capabilities with good object capability design rules, but before we had a coherent notion of ownables or anticipated doing them. Nevertheless, we found that making those objects into ownables was tremendously valuable. So instead of giving out the real seat, you give out an ownable wrapper of the seat that has this make transfer invitation, likewise with the seat resolver. And the fact that it's useful, and because they're just adding a method to the existing protocol without changing the existing protocol, this is an intervention that we can do compatibly within an existing mature system with lots of code already using the existing protocols. So this big surprise that we can do this should not have been as much of a surprise as it was to us, because good object capability design already follows Tribble's first law of object capabilities to reify distinctions in authority as distinct objects. So in this case, the seat representing the right to collect the payouts, the seat resolver representing the right to determine what the payouts are within the constraints of offer safety. So in general, when distinct objects represent distinct authorities, we should ask the question, does the authority is a valuable thing to have if the value itself is transferable value, which it not always is, but in this case it happens to be. If the value is transferable value, you should at least consider making the object in question into an ownable, which you can, again, do typically compatibly in place. So, making the seat into an ownable means that you can sell the right to collect the payouts. So Alice, having gone into the auction and placed a bid, maybe she loses interest in the auction and she just wants to sell to somebody else her right to collect whatever those payouts are, either a refund or the awarded good. This is what's known in finance as a conditional option. It's an option whose payoff depends on other factors. More interestingly, the seat resolver made into an ownable enables what in finance is called order routing. Maybe the original contract that got the seat resolver saying, well, Alice has made available $42 and wants ticket for seat 3F, maybe the original contract is in a position to say, well, there's another contract elsewhere in the network in which the market is thicker or whatever, it represents a better opportunity to fulfill this contract, to fulfill Alice's needs. So by turning the seat resolver into a transfer invitation that can be transferred, it can then credibly transfer it to another contract where the other contract then redeems it for a seat resolver and determines the payout, still with all this order routing, still preserving all of the offer safety constraints. So that concludes the slides, and now I will take final questions. Oh, I want to emphasize one qualification before I take questions, which is in just the same way that I showed the simple piece of code for the mint and then the more complicated piece of code to say I've hidden what's really happening, a complexity that doesn't bear on the points that I'm making. There's been similar shortcuts throughout the talk. Everything I've said is correct and realistic in the abstract, but the actual system is more complicated in ways that I didn't explain. And this final step of making the seat and seat resolver into ownables is not a step that we've taken yet. That step is still in progress. Okay, questions?
I have a question, but I think you may have just answered it. So you were mentioning how ownables sort of have like this described method with which they describe themselves. I can imagine a situation in which, like an odometer in a car, where it'd be very nice if you could rewind, the actual counter. And so now I'm thinking about like malicious ownables. Like, is it in this sort of trust model where you have the mutation that's going on, would it be helpful to either say that like track those mutations on chain somewhere so you can sort of verify them, or use something like zero knowledge proofs to do verifiable compute to assess either like third-party software or something like that, so you can do it in a high trust way to maybe get rid of some of that risk?
Yeah, all of that would be valuable, and all of those are, I would put in the category of additional evidence for increasing confidence. I talked about how to assay behavior. I talked about how a malicious upgrade of the auctioneer cannot violate the offer safety. In the case of ownables, the behavior is introduced by code in smart contracts, where that code itself is also still subject to upgrade and therefore subject to malicious upgrade. So, so when you read, so actually a third field here, I'm sorry, a fifth field here that should have been in the assay behavior is the description has to have adequate information about the governance arrangement around upgrade so that somebody reading, looking at the invitation, deciding, can I trust this counter to continue to operate as I think it will? Let's say only counting up. You not only have to look at the transitive code and the instance, you also have to say, well, what body of, what group of electors is, that forms the governing body for being able to decide to upgrade the code of the counter, and what's their quorum rule? What is the rule by which their individual votes are composed together to make a decision to upgrade? And if you don't trust that body under that voting rule to make good faith decisions about future behaviors, then the description is not, the description doesn't simply represent the current behavior. The description, by the time you redeem it, you might be redeeming it for a future behavior that was determined by a bad governance upgrade decision.
Do we have more questions?
Just to make it clear for me, like where, who owns, for want of a better term, the counter, while sort of like, so it seems to me like the ownership of the counter is transferred into the E-right. Is that a correct way to think about it?
So the way to think about it, I'm going to go back to our, so the way to think about it is the two-phase cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Both phases are ownership. But they're only ownership because they're inside this two-phase cycle. So while you have it as the ownable object on the left, you just have an object capability that's exercisable.
Yeah.
But because one of the methods on that exercisable object is make transfer invitation, you can vacate the house in order to sell it. So while you're living in the house, we would still describe it as you own the house,
right,
but you own the house because you can vacate it and sell it. Once you vacated it and you've put it on the market, you still own it until somebody buys it. So in both phases, you own it because you have the capacity to go around the cycle.
right. So really, like ownership, who owns the counter doesn't change, but the interpretation of ownership is changing. Is
That's
that
right.
the way to think about it? Okay, great, thanks.
Yes.
So maybe I have a follow-up to that. So if I understand correctly, what you are saying here, maybe it's easier to think about the purse example. I can't really make an ownable out of part of an object, right? Because in the purse example, I would like to say that I have at least this amount of money in the purse, and then I can transfer that to someone else, right? But if I recall, if I understand the illustrations on your slides correctly, this isn't really something that's happening. What I need to do is I need to create a new purse. I need to transition the money to that purse, right? And then I make that purse an ownable, right? So I turn an entire object into an ownable.
So the key thing, I think the slide we've got up actually illustrates this rather well. The way you realize ownables on top of object capabilities is the real object with the real mutable state is encapsulated. You never reveal that. The role that you had, like when we made the seat into an ownable, the thing that we're currently exposing as the real seat and making the seat into an ownable, we move that real one into the encapsulated one. We wrap it with the ownable wrapper, and everywhere where we're currently exposing the real seat, we expose the ownable wrapper seat instead. So you could do the same thing with the purse. Now, since purses are sort of part of the infrastructure by which we're realizing E-rights out of object capabilities in the first place, it kind of hurts my brain a little bit to think about doing it for the purses themselves. But it would be an extension of sort of what we've done anyway in making the seats and seat resolvers into ownables. We've kind of taken this whole ownable notion and folded it in on itself. It started off purely as something that was on top of the Zoe level of abstraction. And now that we've invented that, we've moved it down into the Zoe infrastructure itself to make Zoe more expressive and flexible.
Okay, and maybe I have a second question if there is nothing else. So
going back to the relationship between object capabilities and reference capabilities, would it make sense to say that it wouldn't? I mean, like adding reference capabilities to this model might, for example, help you with encapsulating the object capability inside of the ownable, and so that would like give you a utility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is correct. That is correct. And this goes back to the point I was making earlier, that the point I was making about reference capabilities do not give you a local theory of remote misbehavior. They still give you strong guarantees locally that help you statically reason about what's happening locally. So, so this falls into the same category as we were discussing with formal verification or local static type systems. Anything that gives you more confidence for reasoning about local behavior gives you the ability to read the code, or give somebody who's inspecting it and looking at the code, trying to understand what the code means, gives them stronger evidence that they understand what the code means. You just need to make sure you don't confuse yourself at mistaking that as a theory of what's guaranteed about remote misbehavior.
Right. Thanks.
okay, so one last thing. I wanted to ask if you, so we've heard like an economy-centric motivation for the system, right? And I was curious, maybe piggybacking a bit on Tobias asking, like, does this relate to relational capabilities or fractional capabilities? Do you have like a more CS-centric or algorithm-centric motivation for some fragment of the system? Because I was trying to pattern match it to like some need that could be fulfilled by a type system. So I think I see like some relationship to an obscure fragment of Rust where they have something like two-phase borrows, where sometimes it's necessary to create a pointer which can become owned, but only after a certain point, right? So before it becomes owned, it doesn't actually forbid other mutable pointers, right? But after it becomes owned, all previous mutable pointers need to be given up.
Right.
So that actually sounds a bit like an ownable. And like, do you have other examples like this?
Yeah. So I mean, the classic fractional permissions example is readers writers. So readers writers is sort of a pure transition between something that is more transmissible, more shareable, because you've given up mutability, and then you have to gather things together into a narrower access in order to re-enable mutability, and then you can go back and forth between the writing mode and the reading mode. Now, the difference, I would say, in all these cases, is that the transition back to the mutable form is forced, in the sense that if you had shared the E-right, then anybody using the redeeming the E-right with an offer has used up everybody's form of the E-right. And likewise in the other direction. In both cases, you have a forced transition. Is that if you had shared the mutable ownable with others, then anybody invoking make transfer invitation revokes it preventing everyone from using it, whereas these fractional permission systems or like language systems like Rust, readers, writers, all of these things are generally cooperative coordination things where you depend on all the participants offering to give up the thing that they need in order to do the state transition rather than having the revoking imposed on them. James?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that fractional permissions, or since John Boylan isn't in the room, if you call them inverse reference counts, yeah, that took me 10 years to get. Those are clearly global for the reason that reference counts are global. And shilling, I'll pretend it's shilling my postdoc's work, actually it's shilling Sophia's work. I think there's an interesting space where you actually make topologically local and temporally scoped guarantees. So there's a difference, and it's a crucial difference.
Say that phrase again. What local and temporally scoped?
For the tape, what did I say? I said temporary, effectively temporally scoped, and in fact topologically scoped or topologically local guarantees.
Oh, okay. Topologically local. Okay.
So I'm not saying, as with pretty much any reference any kind of reference capability system, it says I'm saying something about my view of the whole world. You want systems that can say something about my view only of the part of the world that I can see. And that may have something to do with the fact that I was late this morning, but we'll talk. Yeah. Anyway,
yeah,
I think that's a really important distinction, and there's actually more space there than perhaps we originally thought.
Yeah, and the work that you and Sophia and others have done on those proof systems, chainmail and necessity, etc. That's been a collaboration with this line of work, and has had a lot of influence on this line of work. The way I think about how to architect the system so that I continue to have safety properties that I know I can reason about safely has very much been influenced by thinking about, well, what if I was writing a chainmail proof of safety for this stuff, and this locality in the reference graph and the temporal nature of the two phases and all that, very much influenced by that work.
Okay, excellent. By now, only 10 minutes remain in the coffee break. So I think that if there are no more questions, maybe we can go and grab a coffee and then come back here in a moment.